Hey guys, back for part three of stories my dad told me. You know, and these couple stories are from the when he was in the army in the Philippines. All right, so the first story, there's actually two stories here. The first one's not funny, but the second one is kind of funny. It's pretty funny. I got a kick out of it. So anyway, the first story is there was uh, a situation where my dad had the guys when he was this is when he was after he got his field commission and everything. He was second lieutenant, so he's basically the platoon leader. Okay. Now of course there's captains. When I say the leader, I mean like the direct field leader. You know what I mean? The guy that goes out, he still goes out and patrols with these guys. He's not like sitting in some tent, or whatever. Like the captains and above, right? They're usually the ones that are making this. They might be making the big decisions and all that, but they're not really going out on patrol anymore and stuff like that. Usually, okay. So when I say platoon leader, you're either talking about the lieutenant or the sergeant, okay, in the platoon or squad or patrol. Usually the patrols would be like 12 guys generally. There'd be like usually not more than 12 guys at one time on one patrol. Platoon could usually be up to almost 50 guys total. But anyway, so there was he was briefing the guys, right? So he had the guys all lined up, and he was just giving them a briefing, right? About what they're gonna do and stuff like that, how things are going or what's going on, right? So there was one guy that was, I think, probably in the front row that was a replacement, and so he was a new guy, And he was from what I understand when my dad was telling me, he's kind of a bigger guy too, right? And of course my dad's short, was 5'6", 135 pounds at that time, okay. So but he was he'd been around. You know what I mean? He was he knew the score. He was and he had the respect of all the guys that were with him. From for at least like whatever for 6 months or a year or whatever from the beginning, and they were still alive and everything. Those guys knew that my dad had their respect already. You know what I mean? Like he they knew that he was, knew what he was doing and stuff. So, but this was a new guy, right? A replacement. And so my dad was like talking to the guys, basically, at the beginning. I think it was pretty much at the beginning of the briefing. And this guy's opens up his mouth. He's like a smartass, and now I don't know if he meant, if he kind of said this out loud. He said it out loud, right? I mean, my dad heard him. I think other guys in the squad heard him say it. You know what I mean? So it's not like he just muttered it, under his breath or whatever. He said it loud enough to where guys heard him. But he just looks at my dad and he's thinking, he's like kind of laughs and he's like, like, who's this little shit, or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, he says something smart ass like that, about my dad's stature, you know what I mean? Like, who's this fucking little shit, And so initially my dad, he hears it and he sort of continues on with whatever he was saying. And then as soon as he finished whatever subject he was talking about, he immediately says, he kind of starts walking back and forth and he says, we're going to try something different today, guys. I'm going to do a little self-defense exercise with one of you guys. And as he's walking, in front of these guys, all the guys, he stops right in front of the big guy that mouthed off to him, And he stops and then he turns to him and says, all right, sergeant, or not sergeant, but private, whatever he was, right? Private, corporal, I'm not sure, but he probably wasn't higher than a corporal. And he might have been a private. And he just said, like, I'll just say Private Blank because I don't know what his name was, and if I did, I wouldn't say it anyway. But he's like, Private Blank, you're going to be my volunteer. So what we're going to do is a little self-defense drill here. So I want you to, so they each had their rifles in their hand, right? At this point, like, I mean, he had them around his shoulder, over his shoulder, but now, he says, all right, take your rifle into your hands, Private. So he does, And then my dad's got his rifle too, right, in his hand. And he says, all right, Private, I want you to try to take my head off with the butt of that rifle, I want you to try and take me down, try and knock me on the ground, And the guy says, okay, sure, So, so they're both standing there, obviously in a defensive position. And now the private tries to take my dad's head off with the butt of the rifle. And my dad blocks him with his rifle and then immediately comes around and, with the same rifle and whacks him in the jaw, knocks him down, right? Just like a block and then wham, real fast, like hand to hand, this is like hand-to-hand combat training, right? And not only does he knock him down, but I think he broke his jaw, because he really whacked him, And of course the guy's laying on the ground and he's like, whatever, my jaw's broke, or whatever. And then my dad probably just called for the medic or whatever to take him to the medical tent. But before he did, and then he said. Or he may have done it, right? Like he might have had him taken away, but I don't think he did. I think they actually brought him to the medical tent, he asked his sergeant, I'm pretty sure he probably asked his sergeant, who's been with him for a while, and was, knew him and everything, on good terms, of course. And he said, Sergeant, what happened here? And the sergeant said, well, Lieutenant, Private Blank got injured in a training exercise. And my dad says, that's right. And then he looks at the platoon. He says, anybody else see anything different? And nobody said anything. No, sir. Yeah, he got hurt in a training exercise. Said, all right, as you were, And then that was it, basically, right? And then he took the guy to the medical tent, whatever. And and the reason he did that whole thing was, not because you have to retain respect. Okay, when you're a platoon leader, you can't have some new guy coming in and mouthing off to you and disrespecting you. You just can't have it. Even though there's and it's funny because as soon as that guy mouthed off, I'm sure my dad's sergeant was like, oh shit, he probably looked down and said, what a dumbass, you know what I mean, like, because he knew my dad was not gonna take that shit, sitting down, so to speak. And so anyway, that was one story, right? So and then of course after that, now everybody knows, not to mess with my dad. There was something else I want to add here. This is sort of related in a way, but there's another thing my dad told me about when he was lieutenant, and especially after the incident at Tigbao, which if you watch my previous video, you'll understand what that was about. But especially after that, he really didn't want to get to know anybody. You know what I mean? Like he didn't want to sort of make any new friends or anything, or didn't even want to know some of the replacements that were coming, and he literally said, like, if a new guy came in and reported to him, he wouldn't even look at him, like he would just turn his back, or he would sit and with his back turned against him and just would read like, okay, you're private, blah, 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 you came from here, you came from there, and the guy would say yes sir or whatever. He'd say, okay, And he might have probably even said, I just don't want to know you, Like, it's not good that I don't like you. It's just that I don't want to get to know anybody. I've been here too long, type of thing, I've seen too many other guys die, basically, right? Friends of mine even, So that was just a little something I wanted to add because that has to do with replacements also, And they were getting, my dad arrived in the Philippines as a replacement, in November of, in November of 44. And so anyway, there's just a little extra little story I wanted to tell you about on that. He just got to the point where I think he had been there. I mean, at this point, he was probably there for like, it was probably into early 46 at this point. You know what I mean? Where he was just so like, you just get so, so overwhelmed with, losing guys and shit like that that you just don't even want to get to know anybody after that. And the other, all right, so then the second story, this one's funny. This one's pretty funny. So just so you know, as a little background, of course, for anyone who's never been to the Philippines, it's very hot here. Very hot, humid, especially in the jungle. At certain times, at least, certain times of the year, it's rainy. They have a rainy season. Other times of the year, it's just straight up hot. And I remember my dad telling me, like, he goes, I was always wet. It was you were either wet from sweat or you were wet from the rain, but you were always wet. So your uniform would just get really, you'd constantly have to try to dry it out, and stuff like that. It was just a struggle just to keep dry clothes. You know what I mean? So, I used to say that all the time. So one day he had the guys together. He got them together and he said, "All right, guys," he said, "I got some good news and some bad news." And the guys are like, "Oh, what's the good news, sir?" And he says, "The good news is today everybody gets to change their underwear." And then one of the other guys says, "Oh, okay. Well, what's the bad news, sir?" My dad says, "The bad news is you change with him, you change with him, and you change with him." Like you might have put the names in there, like, Jones, you change with Smith, Johnson, you change with, Wilson, you know what I mean? Like, you might have used their names, but the bottom line is, you change with him, you change with him. And of course, they did laugh, he said that most of them broke out laughing, because, humor's important, man, when you're in adverse conditions, it is pretty important to keep your sanity, just to kind of retain your humor, even though sometimes it's gallows type humor, you know what I mean? But whatever. Humor is humor, and they got a kick out of that, I just thought I would add that story. But that's about it. This is actually part 3 of the My Dad's Stories series, and probably it'll be the last one, of this whole series. I can't really think of anything else. There's a few other things that I'll just generalize about, like in civilian life, like later and later years, that my dad had a hell of a time with, one of my older brothers was, you could almost say he was famous in the neighborhood, when we were in Chicago, and probably he was the number one reason why we moved to the suburbs in the late 60s, because he was getting in so much trouble in the city. And my dad was just constantly picking him up at the police station and stuff like that. Just to add to, I've already told you all the other stuff that my dad had been through, like even in civilian life, like, before and after the war, right? All the stuff that he'd been through. And then this was something that, he never really, he didn't write anything about this in the journal, of course. But believe me, it happened, and it was just it was something that probably every parent dreads. You know what I mean? When you have a baby and that you just kind of hope that they're not gonna turn out to be an overload on your circuits. You know what I mean? But anyway, one of my brothers was certainly famous. Let's just put it that way, in the neighborhood. Anyway, I just wanted to add that, and that's about it, guys. I'll talk to you guys later. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this series. I really appreciate it. All right, guys. I'll see you later.